One, two, three, four.
You are listening to SKYLIT, the SKYLIT Books podcast. SKYLIT Books is a general interest bookstore in the Los Feliz neighborhood in Los Angeles. You can shop with us from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. or visit us online 24/7 at skylitbooks.com. Follow along at SKYLIT Books Instagram and Twitter. You can subscribe to the podcast on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Thank you for listening, and now on to the episode.
Hello to my beautiful listeners and welcome to SKYLIT. This is the SKYLIT Books podcast and I'm your host, Lance Morgan. Today I'm so excited to welcome Daphne A. Brooks to talk about her new book, Liner Notes for the Revolution, The Intellectual Life of Black Feminist Sound. She'll be in conversation with Lynell George, but before I introduce them, I want to remind you that SKYLIT Books is now fully open, so come on by. Make sure to look at our guidelines before you come on by, but you're welcome to come on in. We're still offering online ordering on our website, www.skylitbooks.com, so feel free to look at our website as well. Daphne A. Brooks is a William R. Keenan Jr. Professor of African American Studies, American Studies, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Music at Yale University, and the author of Jeff Buckley's Grace and of Bodies in Dissent, winner of the Errol Hill Award for Outstanding Scholarship in African American Performance Studies. She has written liner notes to accompany the recordings of Aretha Franklin, Tammy Terrell, and Prince, as well as stories for the New York Times, The Guardian, The Nation, and Pitchfork. Today, Daphne will be in conversation with Lynell George, who is an LA-based journalist and essayist. She has a long career in LA journalism as a staff writer for both the Los Angeles Times and LA Weekly, focusing on social issues, human behavior, visual arts, music, and literature. Her arts and culture writing has been featured on KCET, Artbound, and KPCC's The Frame. She is the author of No Crystal Stair, African Americans in the City of Angels, a collection of features and essays drawn from her reporting. After Image, Los Angeles Outside the Frame. She has won a 2017 Grammy for her liner notes, Otis Redding Live at the Whiskey A Go-Go, and is a 2020 recipient of a Distinguished Journalist Award from the Society of Professional Journalists Los Angeles. Her latest book, A Handful of Earth, A Handful of Sky, The World of Octavia E. Butler, is a finalist for a Hugo Award. Welcome, Daphne and Lynell. I'm so excited to have you. And sorry if I, during that introduction, mispronounced some stuff. No, it was, but I'm so excited to have you both. This is going to be a wonderful episode.
Thank you so much, Lance, for having us.
No problem. It's my pleasure. So, Daphne, you have a reading for us today?
Yes, I do. So I'm going to start off with the opening pages of the book, the introduction. And if there's time, I'm going to share the opening pages of each of the two parts of the book. The book is divided into side A and side B in homage to the vinyl experience that I grew up with and that guides at least part of the vision in the book. So let me get started. Quiet as it's kept, Black women of sound have a secret. Theirs is a history unfolding on other frequencies while the world adores them and yet mishears them, celebrates them and yet ignores them, heralds them and simultaneously devalues them. Theirs is a history that is nonetheless populated with revolutionaries, turn of the century vaudevillian Muriel Ringgold, rocking her entirety in full costume as the sea, blues trailblazer Mamie Smith, breaking the era of modern records wide open, all crazy and staggerly style love. Opera ingenue Anne Brown, rewriting Bess to Gershwin's Porgy. High Priestess Nina orchestrating a Brechtenfile tempest aimed at overturning Jim Crow. and slinky Afro-cosmopolitan Eartha staging her own geopolitical cabaret. It's a history wide enough to encompass rebel with her own cause, rock and roller Etta James in a fast car out on the open road, and folk historian Odetta going deep into scholar, thinker, rule breaker Zora's precious vault so that the real work, songs, can begin. It's teen Aretha in shimmering sequins attacking Al Jolson's Swanee, and those glam ambassadors, the Supremes, pointing us towards somewhere, one day after a king had been slain. It's the body and soul of a grown-ass musician building bridges over troubled water for her listeners, the electric kinetics of Anna Mae Bullock breaking free from domestic tyranny, funk philosopher Betty Davis inventing her own erotic lexicon, an intergalactic trio LaBelle delivering Afrofuturist theory all up in the club. Theirs is a history of the utopic and the transformative, the strange and the strategically unruly. Diana reaching out and touching the hands of the multitudes in the Central Park rain. Afropunk godmother Grace driving Atlantic World nightlife right to the edge, while polystyrene and skin work on burning the whole house down. It's Whitney's melisma lighting up post-civil rights America, and it's Ms. Hill with her renegade contralto scoring 1,000 turn of the century sorrow songs for the hip hop generation. It's a hardworking H-Town new millennium storm system performing radical Black pop feminism to fight catastrophe. And it's her avant-garde genius baby sis staging a blackest of Black uprising right in the center of the lily white Guggenheim. Theirs is a history of game-changing art that stands as an affirmation of our past, as well as the unrecorded future of sound, that which is booming in the not yet, the place where all those sisters of the Yam are running us straight into the dawn. Liner Notes for the Revolution tells the story of how Black women musicians have made the modern world. It is the first extensive archival interrogation of what ethnomusicologist Christopher Small has famously referred to as the quote-unquote musicking extending in all directions in our world, end quote, made by women who have been overlooked or underappreciated, misread, and sometimes lazily mythologized, underestimated, and sometimes entirely disregarded, and above all else, perpetually under-theorized by generations of critics for much of the last 100 years. These critics and tastemakers, collectors, and far too many scholars have engaged in a long game, one that involves oversimplifying, simplistically romanticizing, and at key moments, rapturously cry me a river, sentimentalizing the complexities of Black women musicians' work. It is the problem of their hold on the narratives about Black women's sonic artistry that constitutes a significant portion of this book. But make no mistake, they are not the stars of this show. Rather, it is the remarkable sisters who both have made and have been thinking and writing about Black women's music for over a century now. They are the ones who stand front and center in this study. And they're the ones who have so fundamentally reshaped structures of feeling and expressive cultural forms in the popular domain since the dawn of the 20th century that one would be hard-pressed to imagine an American culture without their influence. But do we even know some of these sisters' names? These women, this book argues, are culture makers who often labor right before our very eyes and ears without our recognition of the magnitude of their import. And the revolution that they waged was one in which the articulation of more life, to cite Tony Kushner, more life could, for a dispossessed people, be sounded out in many registers and tied to the core meaning and vision of liberation itself. Implicit in so much of their work is the stirring and glorious declaration once made by Zora that you don't know us Negroes, quote unquote. From side A of the book, I'll read briefly. For much of the last century, pop music writers and the latter-day institutions that support and promote their claims have been anything but kind to Black women musicians. Plenty of people would argue otherwise, citing, for instance, the long-running tendency of pop music writers to think in hagiographic terms about the mothers and empresses, the queens, so many queens and high priestesses who have dazzled and destroyed audiences for one generation to the next, and who have belted out the soundtrack to our interior lives as we face the uncertainty, the volatility, the exhilaration, as well as the sorrows of modern times. And they'd be right to call our attention to the ways that these sisters, so beloved the world over, are worthy of monarchical metaphors. They built kingdoms of sound for the people who remained largely unseen or misread, vilified and unloved for much of the 400-year crawl that constitutes this singular and more than a little bit terrifying experiment that would come to be known as America. Yet these sonically electrifying worlds are ones that were and still remain largely controlled and engineered by a marketplace that they've never run. It's an operation that made their sounds available to the masses and gave wide technological access to others to mimic and enjoy. At the same time, it was not a phenomenon built to last, which is to say that in spite of the mass and massive exposure and circulation of popular music made by Black women, in spite of the varying instances of intense and sometimes rabid adoration, the kind that fosters fan hives and all sorts of obsessive idolatry, history reminds us that until quite recently, with, say, the death of an unprecedented icon here and the release of a watershed album there, theirs has always been a culture marked as disposable, as less worthy of serious intellectual regard, writerly love, as it were, and institutional recognition. Finally, I'm going to wrap up by reading the first paragraph of side B to give you a sense of the arc of the book. We are engaged in a beautiful struggle to take back that which belongs to us, to get closer to the multitudes that we miss and the dear ones that we miss. Such a battle requires that we think, dream, plot, and prepare ourselves to write from an angular position, to generate critical tales that run askew from the standard script. Such an effort demands that we stretch the limits of our imagination and test the boundaries of the speculative. This is the kind of experimental endeavor that makes it possible to draft avant-garde liner notes in the language of Afrofuturist androids and to compose regional folk odes to the quixotic elsewhere, like the kind made by polymath contrarians. Such questing and querying modes of the expressive are the forms we might summon to imperfectly approximate the artistic passions of, say, a solitary postbellum music critic, or the wished-for conversations between disparate feminist radicals. We rehearse, we research, and we narrate both the possible and the impossible. We entertain valid conjectures, compelling theories of the what-if, would-be scenarios and alternate endings, and above all else, we turn to the music that warrants our scrupulous Black feminist attention, our inspired notes, drafted from a variety of different perspectives and sounded out in as many keys as we might dare to play at once.
Wow, thank you so much for this. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Okay.
Hi, Lynell George.
Hi, Daphne Brooks. We're almost together in the room.
I know.
And I have to say, the experience of spending time with your narrative has been like a conversation already, for me, and an essential one, and one I didn't even really know how much I needed, because there were so many moments in it where the resonance was just like, it was just body reverberation, like, oh my gosh, yes, this, or, oh, that's why, or Anyway, so I could talk to you for hours and probably will eventually, but
I want that.
but I'm gonna jump in, and I try to like pare things down so for our podcast, but we will have an extended conversation, I know. But first, what a glorious book, and thank you for the gift of it.
Thank you.
It's a corrective, it's an embrace. It speaks directly to all of these essential lists and starred systems that of criticism that we have navigated through, lived through for decades. I can't, and it turns it all on its head and makes us think it forces our brain to work in a different way about what is before us and how we judge it and how it marks us. You mentioned in passing, just when we were having a casual conversation before this, that this book was years long in the making. What were the seeds and how did it haunt you over the years?
Yeah, well, thank you. And first of all, thank you, Lynell George. We don't want to embarrass people on podcasts, but you've been such a hero to me for so many years, and a model of how to write and how to think and how to be brave as a writer and thinker. So the honor is all mine to be here. I've answered that question a few different ways. There's like the deep dive way, and then there's the uber professional way. The deep dive way is to say that, I'm a born and bred Northern Californian from the San Francisco Bay Area. And this is usually where people give pause, and then I can elaborate. I'm what's called in my family a menopause baby, meaning that they weren't expecting me. I came late. And, I entered into a much older family of, two siblings who were spaced far apart in and of themselves. But my brother was 17 years older than me, is 17 years older than me. My sister is 10 years older than me. And my parents thought they were done. They were civil rights educators who'd migrated from Texas and Arkansas in 1950 to Berkeley. And by the time I came along, they'd moved down to Menlo Park, which is right next door to Palo Alto for non-Northern Californians. And there was so much music in my house, and I absorbed it all. And those are the kinds of stories we all have of, the father who's listening to Count Basie and Duke Ellington, and the mother who was listening to that too, but who I've been thinking a lot more about her. She's 95 now, and about how, and she's in the book, but how she really embraced the Spinners and Al Green as her grown ass women's delightful, music. And my brother had the Temptations, my sister had the Jackson 5. And there was a kind of way that moving the radio station down the dial to these AOR stations just piqued my interest and, had me falling in love with both the new wave that was getting picked up on some of the newer radio stations in San Francisco. KQAK came later when I was in high school, but the Police were like a kind of crossover band for me, and nobody wanted to talk to me about that music in the house. So I'm like jamming to the Clash and the Police, and I'm also very intrigued by the psychedelia and the hangover post-psychedelia period in the San Francisco Bay Area that's saturated with Bill Graham presents, shows. And so coming up around, Boz Scaggs and Steve Miller, these were all like names that were Eddie Money, right? But they were not. So I was finding that on the radio. I wasn't finding that in the home. And because I was always a very literary, obsessed person, which is important to the narrative too. I wanted to read about the music and have conversations about the music with someone. And that took me to Tower Records, which was just, right. It was just everything, right. Tower Records.
Oh, I lived at Tower.
Right? Tower, right. California, origins, Sacramento. And one of their biggest stores that opened when I was a kid was in Los Altos / Mountain View, California, which is right next door to Palo Alto. And I would save up my money and go, take the bus down to Tower. And, I'd be living in the bins, but also because it was such a huge outlet of their store, there was a big book section. And so then I was right up in the racks, like reading Rolling Stone, reading Cream, reading Hit Parade, looking at some of the books that were considered, actually literary in relation to the music, like Grail Marcus's Mystery Train.
Right.
And I just lived for a long time with the ideas about how the music was written about. And I dreamed of being a rock critic. I told my professors at Berkeley at first that I didn't want to go to graduate school because I wanted to be the first Black feminist critic to have a column at Rolling Stone magazine. And like, girl, don't you want healthcare? Right? So whatever, that's a whole other thing. But so the book kind of, it grew out of these questions that I'd been living with for my entire readerly life about what it meant to find yourself in both, what it meant to identify with certain kinds of sounds and then not be able to find yourself represented in the culture linked to the sounds. And so that's the long arc of it,
It sounds very familiar.
Yes.
Me as a listener, and when you talk about listening across the dial, and that is the beauty, I think, of radio. It's an atlas in a way too, because you can move through, just kind of living on the band, and it takes you into all of these different worlds. And then if you decide I want to jump in and go live, it takes you physically into places you would not necessarily be in. And it makes your world bigger.
Yes. It absolutely, it makes your world bigger. It makes you kind of imagine and experiment and rehearse all of these different ways of being, which, music is always hailing you to do. And, as a post-civil rights child, we have great studies like Maureen Mann's first book, The Right to Rock, about the Black Rock Coalition, right? And about what it meant for our generation of African Americans to first be buzzed. I wish we'd been buzzed. That would maybe a little bit easier, right? Exactly. But bust into these integrated settings. And so picking up on a lot of music that we didn't hear in the home and trying to, claim it as our own. And actually we know, of course, from the Black Rock Coalition and from just good study that the music really was ours, and so being able to reclaim that, right?
That's
and
right.
So,
exactly.
Yeah. And I think that the writing piece of it that I felt was very fraught for me was recognizing the ways in which the gonzo journalism that I also, being so deeply Bay Area, I mean, this is, this was a revolution that, emerged not just out of the Bay Area, but I always like to say as a Berkeley alum, was so central to UC Berkeley because of the complicated figure who is Jan Wenner, who, ended at Rolling Stone, came into Berkeley, Ralph Gleason, who was, in the Bay Area, but there are tons of, Grail Marcus went through Berkeley, and Powers and Eric Weisbart, et cetera, et cetera. But the point being that, I think I was around a real kind of intellectual life world that it was attached to the music. And it was very personalized, and very eccentric and sui generis. And I wanted to be able to write like that and have my own imprint like that on the music and on the narratives of the music. And because it was far and few between the examples of where I could see myself represented in that way, and that's why someone like you was so important to me when I was in graduate school, seeing you out there, Danielle Smith, Joan Morgan, real path-breaking sisters. And, another way to think about how this book came to be was to ask questions about there were women, we were always there. So who were the sisters who were before, who came before? And they left their seeds and their resonances, to use your word, that was such a moving word, all around us. And it's just about kind of picking up their frequencies again.
It's really true. I definitely, when I got to the sections about these women who, and I don't want to race ahead because I really want to talk about that, because that really struck me too, because I remember in 9th grade sitting in the back of my English class, and I was bored and, in my English class because, the teacher was babysitting, some students, and I just was like, but bless him, he had copies of Rolling Stone in the back of his classroom, and there was a sofa and it was covered with this tie-dye,
I love it.
Cover. And I would sit in the back and read these Rolling Stone. And, and the music, yes, drew me first and reading the music writing, but then it was reading the news writing and the feature writing.
Yes.
And as you said, that voice as a model,
Yes.
of like,
Yes.
oh, this is the way I can enter the music. This is the way I can enter the world,
Yeah.
and look, I can write this way where I'm
Yes.
using elements of fiction, in
Yes.
terms of the descriptions and
Right.
place setting and having
Right.
people speak and interact and
Yeah.
write it with authority. And as you
Yes.
said, to
Okay.
find, but not to be able to find us.
Mhm.
So my question,
Hmm.
one of the things that was really important to me, let me see, maybe I'll jump down to this one too, because you highlight some early figures of import. Pauline Hopkins, Lorraine O'Grady, who I'm like,
Yes. Oh my God.
Phil Garland,
Yes. Oh
only
my
to
God.
name a few.
Yes. Cynthia
And
Dagnall-Myron.
that's right.
Also, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
But Black women were not marginal, they
Right.
were marginalized,
Yes.
and that
Yes,
is
that's
the
right.
part that you really make clear.
Yes.
And I started bobbing my head with you, like it was this big yes to your music, your writing.
Yeah.
And the writing is just gorgeous. Everyone, please, the book is just, I just kind of waltzed along with her because again, you got it's like you're pulling in like the history, and then we're also like, I'm sitting knee to knee with you and we're just talking. We're just talking. And that's what made it. But back to my question. But when I was reading the section, particularly about profile writing and how editors, when you're writing about a woman artist versus a man artist and what people wanted, what editors expected. And I thought, I hadn't even thought about it that way, but it's true. Like, for men, it was their ideas and their trappings and their successes and their lists. And for women, it was the clothes and the domestic life expectations and all of that.
Yes.
And I was especially moved by that story about Esther Phillips.
Yes.
And the narrowness of expectations.
Right.
Can you speak a little bit about this and the wily ways these forebears worked around these industry standards?
Oh, that's so beautiful. It's a beautiful question. Yeah, the example that you give is taken from an Ebony feature written by the great Phil Garland. Everyone should look up Phil Garland. I think we're beginning to have a little Phil Garland renaissance, right? Sadly, in the wake of her passing in the early aughts, but she wrote a book called The Sound of Soul and was just this mammoth music critic who wrote for Ebony as well as a number of other outlets. And then by the 80s started teaching at Columbia J School. That feature on Esther Phillips was really about kind of, trying to subvert our expectations of really spending a disproportionate amount of time on Esther Phillips' personal narratives, her struggles with substance abuse, and really just a very, very difficult, her career that ended tragically. And I really wanted to pay attention throughout the book, but in this case, in Phil's case, this is a great example, I hope, of this, of the craft of building a narrative around the music that's critical and expansive and about ideas, as you mentioned. And for Phil Garland, who was deeply, deeply and openly influenced by Amiri Baraka and by his path-breaking, history-making book, Blues People, she had a very strong focus on the ways in which music was tied to Black nationalist possibility. And I'm going to let that just hang in the air because there are a lot of different ways we can define Black nationalism, but she really did believe in a kind of the world-making possibilities, Black world-making possibilities of Black sound. And in the Esther Phillips profile, it opens with her at the outdoor Lincoln Center concert, which has its ties to a much larger story about Black nationalist cultures. The late, great Ellis Hazlip, queer brother, who's the star of Mr. Soul, right? This brilliant feature by his cousin, documentary by his cousin, Melissa Hazlip, which came out last year. Everyone should see it. But so he had fantastic, right? So he had this weekly PBS show like nothing else that was about Black arts and culture and politics, but he also hosted, and my great colleague, The scholar Gail Wald has written about this in her book, It's Been Beautiful, that charts the whole history of Ellis Hazlip and his soul program. He did an outdoor concert series that brought Black folks into these spaces in which people couldn't imagine them, like Lincoln Center, even though for New York City history wonks, we know that that was a site that was originally, African-American residences, or it had been in the mid-century before it was completely razed to build Lincoln Center. So for her to kind of to start by centering her reader in this Black space, this reoccupied, Black space, and to think about what Esther Phillips' music and her aesthetic labor is doing in that space was not only about, honoring Esther Phillips. It was also, for me, calling readers to pay attention to what Black writers can do and Black women writers can do if we can open ourselves up to listening to the world through their ears. And so that's something that I feel like is a part of the pedagogy of the book that, speaks to how to, buck the kinds of conventions of what we're expected to be writing about popular musicians.
Because so often it's like, the assignment, and I know for me is like, especially in my early years, is there really was this idea about like what was deemed cool, or as you mentioned too, authentic.
Yes.
The artists that could be written about.
Yeah.
And people outside of our culture and race were making these decisions, and we were having to go to battle to write about the people that you have, thank goodness, shown a light on in this book. Because so many of these people, like the culture bearers, the people who like were playing, I think about like the certain like jazz piano players who were playing gigs here in LA, who were not, going to be written about in the national press, but they were there every week for 20 years, sitting at their piano. When I was sitting as I was reading along, and I hadn't even gotten to her name yet. And then you mentioned Dorothy Donegan. And of course, I had already started thinking about her, seeing her at the old Catalina Bar and Grill Jazz Club.
Yes, Catalina Bar and Grill.
With her purse that she brought, took it off her arm, plumped it on
like
top
Aretha.
of the piano.
Yeah, like Aretha.
Like, I'm not leaving my purse in the bathroom.
Right.
That's what you elevated these people, because that was it. It's like, I felt like finally someone is doing this. And that's what I wanted to ask you too, is I'm particularly fascinated about how you open this definition of what it was to be a critic, but even more important, what it is to be a witness. And our culture bearers, the folks who are working in the trenches, the Dorothy Donegans too, or the people writing about the Dorothy Donegans or trying to write about the Dorothy Donegans, are just as important as the bylines in the magazines and newspapers, or even more so, would you say?
Yes. Yeah.
So how are you getting to some of these people who had like been lost to the margins, or been marginalized?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I'm glad that you brought up Dorothy Donegan, because I'm completely indebted to one of the figures who takes up one of the longer chapters in the book, this woman named Rosetta Wrights, who was white, Jewish, right? Second waiver. Oh my God. I mean, just incredible.
I want those records.
Yeah. And they are available. So she largely through eBay, but there are some that you can find on Amazon.
The train songs I want to hear.
Yes. Oh, those, right. And those first few anthology records, really do document, the early blues, the early classic women's blues in ways that nobody else was doing. Rosetta Wrights, she's a boomer, second waiver, maybe actually a little bit older than boomer. I get the markings wrong here sometimes, but she passed in 2008, but she's, in the late 70s writing about menopause. And she starts listening to Bessie Smith, and she talked about this many times in the profiles that, were published about her in the press once, her success story did get out during her lifetime, thankfully. But she realized that a good number of the classic women's blues recordings were out of print, which was infuriating to her. And, you know, she had lived through the second blues revival, the transatlantic, you know, embrace of Robert Johnson, et cetera, which becomes a pathway to the era of classic, the golden age of rock music criticism as well. People like, you know, Grail, you know, and others were writing about Robert Johnson. She was infuriated by this erasure, and she pulled her money together and started her own indie label, Rosetta Records, and, you know, ultimately ended up putting out 19 full-length albums that you know, document the history of classic women's blues, and went, you know, had a real commitment to both being able to expand the lexicon of what we understood about people like Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey, but also identify those people in the margins, like Dorothy Donegan, like you were talking about. She had this prodigious, really formidable knowledge of blues women's history. And so in addition to putting these recordings out, she, in her own kind of intellectual revolution, decided, I'm going to write these really fierce, radical liner notes to each of these albums that, you know, finds a way to do the radical work of revaluing this music. And that's something that we, you know, could talk about all day about what it means to actually, the political project of revaluing Black life and the culture emergent out of Black life, you know. So I'm just gonna put a placeholder there, right?
Yeah.
But you know, she was really mindful of that. She felt like it was political and intellectual and aesthetic work. So you find in Rosetta Wright's liner notes and in her 67 boxes of memorabilia and notes, archival materials that she left behind for her wonderful daughter Rebecca to archive, housed at Duke University now. She was rehearsing and figuring out ways of coming up with a whole kind of critical lexicon to talk about blues women's music. And she was openly, you know, and overtly invested in trying to take the language of high art. For instance, you know, she would you know, rip out Time magazine art reviews of Francis Bacon's exhibit at the Tate, and, you know, circle, you know, these lines that talked about, you know, the beauty of his work, and then scramble them around. You know, it was kind of like this beautiful experimental language in order to come up with her own prose about what blues women were doing. And I wanted to really document the labor of what she was doing, to really think, you know, about inventing a grammar that didn't exist, to actually, you know, really care for the magnitude and the depths and the seriousness and the innovation of what Black women musicians were doing. So she's a huge part of this narrative, you know, and I think of her as an intellectual accomplice to the Black women musicians and critics in the book as well, that this is a kind of a collective project if we commit ourselves to trying to think counterintuitively about what we're told and socialized into expecting and believing about the level of value of Black women's art and Black people's art more broadly.
I mean, and this is really, this was so important too, because part of what you do with this book and doing this is, I love how you work with archives, for example, and what having an archive, what people leave, what it tells us about it. And then people who don't, what do we know about them? What don't we know about them? And there's that really beautiful riff, and her name will come to me, but where you start to ask the questions, did she write with the, you know, with a cup of tea, or did she like coffee? Did she write in the morning? Did she listen to music then, you know, here, or did she go out, or this, and all of these things that we have to kind of put together, because part of world building, part of seeing yourself in a place really does come from example. Just a little bit, some concrete something. We want to know, what was it like? What does it take? What does it take to build that kind of a life?
And what are the intimate details of our lives, right? This is what is so often left out of profiles and narratives, Black peoples, which is its own kind of violence, we know.
Right.
Because, if we aren't seen intimately and treated with care, then it becomes possible to put a knee on someone's neck.
That's right.
So, I've had a lot of great examples of trying to write like that and ask those questions, and people who are an inspiration to me. Of course, I would want to acknowledge the MacArthur Genius Fellow, my longtime colleague, Sadia Hartman, whose Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, and also Farah Jasmine Griffin, who's written so beautifully with her path-breaking book about Billie Holiday, 20 years old this year, If You Can't Be Free, Be a Mystery. But, they do a lot of speculative work, which was the last excerpt that I was reading from in the book, is pivoting towards the speculative to be able to think about how to handle the archival traces of people left behind with care. Right. And so, I think this book has been a curious endeavor to some people who expect a particular way of just writing about popular music in general, let alone Black people in popular music, which is to say that there is, I hope people recognize a real ethical arm to the book itself, that I felt that I wanted to both challenge myself, challenge my readers, and challenge my fellow critics, some of whom I have huge disagreements with. And I want to carefully and respectfully disagree with them, to ask questions about the ethics of what we're doing when we're writing about these people who produced great art and left very little of themselves behind for reasons that more often than not have to do with systemic violence, right? So
exactly.
I wanted to be able to think about a different way of writing about Black women in popular music culture that paid attention to that long history that stretches back to 1619.
That's right. I guess I'll end here, because this will, and as I said, you should see the pages of questions I have.
I want to see them.
But I think we'll end here, because this goes directly into what you just finished. You make such a vivid case about our hunger and our need to know more about how these Black women did what they did. The women who were looking, at the expanse, and the women who are creating, and the quotidian ways of making a life. And it really does start with our imagination, and the depth in the stretch of it. And this will stay with me, thinking about, as I think myself, about arts criticism, and the privilege I've had to be able to kind of construct something, even though there wasn't a space for me. I just tried to figure out ways of kind of doing some of this on the sly. And you've got Zora Neale Hurston and Toni Morrison over the shoulder of your shoulder in this book. Women who wrote about landscapes and then interior scapes. And I think about that, and that's world making too. In what way would you say that working on this project was expanding for you? Mind expanding, body expanding, for you. How do you live in the world now after having finished this?
Oh, thank you for that question. My gosh. I guess I'll answer it two ways. One is that coming through this book meant trying to put together all of myselves, and to claim to all of them and honor them, and feel like they could all be in a space together. I mean, that's a line from the great Black feminist statement, the Combahee River Collective Statement from 1976. There's a way in which 77. They were in conversation in 76, but there is a line that Barbara Smith and company have about, being able to be all of yourselves at once. And this book was about that for me, because, I'm somebody who did decide to take that path to get a PhD in English from UCLA, and to teach in English departments at Princeton, and then make the move to Yale, a really pointed move to be able to teach in an interdisciplinary space that allowed me to pick up all these different parts of myself in music, in women's gender and sexuality studies, and American studies, and of course in AFAM. But beyond that, I wanted to continue the charge that I've been on for a long time of trying to meld this so-called academic voice that is infamous in certain circles, and to kind of to destabilize it by melding it with my quote unquote public facing rock critic self, the 12-year-old who was sitting hanging on David Rick's every word and Rolling Stone, and Ann Powers every word, and right and to try to think those things together.
You did it.
Yeah, that means a lot coming from you. That means a lot, and I guess the other thing I'll say is that I also really did try to be bare bones about inviting people who I disagree with, and they are named in this book, to be in a space with me where we could just care for the conversation and the debates and be mindful of our whole beings in those debates. Right. And I wanted to be able to model that for my students, since the generation who, is in the fire right now. And we've got to find ways to be brave enough. And I mean that for, some of the hegemonic folk, but to be in the room with us and to just be vulnerable with each other. So.
Thank you so much for this beautiful gift. Really. Thank you. Thank you. It matters. It's going to matter for so many people like us who grew up kind of wandering around, like wanting to be seen, heard, and, and as you said, and that's so beautifully put about being able to assemble all those selves, and they all work so seamlessly together in this book. So thank you.
Oh, Lynell, George, thank you. Means the world to me. Thank you.
Thank you both. This has been just, just to hear you two speak to each other is so amazing. And you two are just, you're great. You're both great. You're both amazing. And I wish we could have this podcast run forever. I wish, to all my listeners, you could just see the screen. There's just smiles everywhere. There's smiles and love, and I love it all. I love it all. It's great.
This is the greatest.
Well, before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask you both, do you have anything you'd like to say to the independent bookstore community as a whole? I wish you guys could see Lynell's face. She's so excited. I love it.
Independent bookstores I was a bookstore clerk when I was in college, and I think I never left bookstores, especially independent bookstores. There is nothing like forming a relationship with your local bookstore and being, having a book hand sold to you and having people alert you, wait, Lynell, your book has come in. And that is what has kept me afloat during this time, is that community. They were in contact with me when my book came out during a pandemic.
Yes.
They were the ones that offered support. So thank you, SKYLIT, because you were one of the places I was, and I'm just so grateful.
Yes. I mean, everything that Lynell said, and I will also say, because we are sisters from another mother, also bookstore clerk, right after college at Kepler's bookstore back in Menlo Park. But really, my years in Berkeley, what would I have been without Cody's bookstore and Black Oak Books, and Pegasus is still around. There are places where, like the record store, I was able to rehearse and experiment and stay curious. And, I've asked my students how they imagine, whether they can imagine sites where you could meet up to listen to music and to discover books. And it's something that's so heartbreaking to think about potentially losing. And that's why places like SKYLIT are just so absolutely invaluable. So very, very grateful to the entire community and staff of SKYLIT.
Oh my God, thank you both. You both are just so great. So great. And it's just been beautiful to see you both on the screen here like this. I feel like I got the backstage, Pass. I
You
got
did,
the
man.
You did.
We talked about the whole.
That's right.
Yeah.
I got the
He had the right
exclusivity.
laminate. He was wearing the right
Exactly.
laminate.
Exactly.
No, I'm the groupie. I'm the groupie who snuck in through the
You
back.
snuck in.
and
Oh, okay.
I snuck in through the back. I want that, because it has that like more edginess to
It
it.
is better. It is
if you
better.
sn-
Wily. You're
Well,
Right.
wily.
Exactly. Wiley. Wiley is the
Listen,
word of the day. So.
Yeah.
That's what that's why I produce
This
this
is about.
podcast for, is
Yeah.
just to sneak
Oh.
in into the back of all these beautiful conversations like this one today. So, and to all my listeners, you can buy Liner Notes for the Revolution, The Intellectual Life of Black Feminist Sound today at the bookstore. So go on in and buy your copy. It should be in our podcast display section right at the front of the store. And Lynell, your book we also have for sale too. So please buy that. Your Hugo Award finalist book. We have to put that out there for all the Octavia Butler fans. Why aren't you reading this book? This book should be on your bookshelf.
Teaching at Yale this fall. So yay.
Oh my God.
Thank you.
There's
Thank you.
What, that's amazing. So thank you to all my listeners for coming back again. And you have a great, beautiful day to everyone listening. Have a good one.
Thank you for listening to the Skylight Books podcast series. Please don't forget to visit our website at skylightbooks.com and make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast for more author talks and bookseller conversations. You can find us on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you back in our store soon.